Hello, buddy. Welcome back to the Tin Man Score channel. I'm your host, Jeffrey Tin Man Taylor, and today I'm reading another chapter out of my South Carolina Ghost from the Coast to the Mountains book by Nancy Roberts. And the chapter out of here is called Danger House. So without further ado, let's get into it. It was 10 at night when the phone in the Charleston motel room jangled and the man's voice on the other end of the line said, "You may be the only person who will understand when I tell this story." I had been waiting for his call. That morning, I had braved hurricane-like rain to reach the downtown post office and find out whether my newspaper advertisement had produced results. It read, "If you have ever encountered a ghost or had an experience you believe was supernatural, please write at once. This information is for a university press publication." Okay, so in other words, this is the author telling the story on how she got this story in her hands. I had run the ad for a week and driven to Charleston to interview the writers of the replies I hoped to receive, but what if no one had answered? Where would I look next for modern-day ghost stories? To my great relief, the box was half full of letters. Some replies contained episodes that appeared to be supernatural, but were fragmentary. Several had excited my interest, particularly one in a white envelope with the name broader printed in dark blue. The address was James Island. Paul Broder began his story by telling me that he and his wife had spent their vacations in South Carolina for several years before deciding that it was the ideal place for two Yankees like ourselves to retire. An important part of their dream was to buy an old southern home, of course. It must have columns, perhaps a balcony, and some fascinating history to impress their northern friends. I mean, to be honest, I wouldn't mind buying an old plantation mansion myself if I had the money, of course, or one of them old brick farmhouses. 8 years ago, we found just the place we wanted out here on James Island. It wasn't quite in the state of repair we had hoped for, but it was 200 years old. Good Lord, that's an old structure, and had history bursting out of the seams. We were told it had once been headquarters for Confederates and that Jefferson Davis had stayed there. Others said the ghosts of slaves had been seen and even heard in the rooms and on the stairs. We've never believed in ghosts, but we thought that really added spice. I bought it. I remember telling Maggie, tomorrow we go back to Baltimore to our row house and start packing. We've brought up all the kids and it's been fine, but now we're really going to live the good life. You could tell your sister Bridget that your new home is a house where Jeff Davis once stayed. Maggie laughed and said Bridget and her husband O'Malley never heard of Jeff Davis. She was right. I've always been one of those Civil War buffs myself. Well, we moved into the old Clark house in late June. It was on Target Street in Clark's Point subdivision. There were 4 big rooms downstairs and 4 upstairs. Yeah, talk about a big house. That's a lot to dust. We couldn't believe we were living in a house that size at first. What I'm getting to now sounds pretty far out, so it's a good time for me to say that I was a police chief of Baltimore for over 25 years, and anybody who knew me knew I was a down-to-earth man. I saw plenty in a big city, mostly just human meanness, though nothing that couldn't be explained. But from the time we first moved in, Maggie and I noticed weird things about that house. Doors opening and closing, objects in crazy places and noises. Good Lord, the ghosts are starting to get riled up. One night we came in about midnight and were upstairs in bed watching a television movie. All of a sudden we heard a terrible racket in the kitchen. It sounded like every dish in our cupboard was tumbling to the floor and smashing to bits. Maggie and I jumped out of bed and ran downstairs. When we got to the door and looked in, I couldn't believe it. There wasn't a dish on the floor in the kitchen was neat and clean as a nun's collar. Somehow, that was worse than if we had found it in a shambles. Maggie and I looked at each other. She still looks just like a little kid when she gets scared. At that moment, I'll admit, I could feel the hair raise on the back of my neck. I tried to act like the tough cop I always thought I was, and I told her it was just noise from outside, but that noise wasn't outside. It was right in the house with us. It wasn't a week later that we had gone to bed and were lying there in the dark when I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. They weren't like someone trying to sneak up as a thief would do. These were heavy men's steps, the feet slowly shuffling up a step at a time. I looked over at Maggie to say something, but she was asleep. The footsteps came on, and at the top of the stairs, almost outside our door, they stopped. I lay as still as if I were carved out of ice. Finally, they passed on beyond our door and headed toward the front room. I heard the switch click, and as it did, the darkness in the hall was broken by a path of light that shone through the open guest room door. My heart was trying to beat its way out of my chest. An inch at a time, I eased open the drawer of the bedside table and pulled out my revolver, and stood in the hall for a moment. It was so quiet I could hear Maggie's breathing back in the bedroom. As I stood there, the light in the guest room went off. My heart would be beating out of my chest too if I just saw light in the hallway and I remember turning the light off. But I will act like this guy and go investigate. But a gun won't help you against a ghost. I thought of whether I should go in there in the dark. Whoever it was, he was trapped. He couldn't drop from a second-story window. Then there was the shuffling sound. I had nothing to decide. He was coming back. My hand fumbled for the light at the top of the stairs and flipped the switch, but it didn't work. On the footsteps came until they passed me and started down the stairs. As they reached the bottom, the light in the upstairs hall came on, just as if someone had touched the downstairs switch, but the hall below was empty. That is not the only time I heard the steps on the stairs, but I didn't tell Maggie, although I thought she knew some things about the house she was not mentioning. If you guys can see that picture, that's the house that they bought. One night we were eating in the kitchen and smoke began to seep out of a crack in the wall behind me. In a moment it was in flames. Luckily I managed to put it out with a fire extinguisher we kept near the stove. Sometimes the wiring is bad in old houses. That is true. Maggie said, so next day we had an electrician come. You have a burned place here, but the wiring as far inside I could see it is brand new. He told us, shaking his head. Summer passed, and one September evening I was sitting on the front porch with a friend named Dobbs, who lives nearby. He talked about seeing the shadowy figure of an old lady rocking back and forth on the porch. It always looked like it might be an old Mrs. Clark, he said. I don't know what made me do it, but I shook back. Well, that's better than seeing the devil. As I spoke, the wall next to us exploded in a burst of flames. I decided right then that I was going to sell that house if I could stay alive long enough to do it, and I did. I thanked the gentleman for calling and asked if I might see the house. I wish you could, he said, but a few weeks after we sold it, the old Clark place burned to the ground. Now, well, that's kind of suspicious, ain't it? Maybe there was some demonic force at work. You never know. And the electrician said the wire was brand new. I mean, there's no way that the darn thing can spark unless it made contact with the wood and framing. I don't know. But yeah, that's strange. You were lucky to get out of that house when you did. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this ghost story out of the South Carolina Ghost book by Nancy Roberts. Don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on post notifications for more book reading content like this. This has been another successful installment of the Tin Man's Quarter channel. I'm your host, Jeffrey Tin Man Taylor. I say that's a wrap, and that's day, y'all.